Campbell Chapter 51, Animal Behavior. What I would suggest you doing is printing off the student copy of the notes and filling them in as the lecture progresses, and taking any additional notes that you feel you may need during this audio lecture. So we talked about the fiddler, I'm missing the R there, crab, and we talked about how they had, specifically the males had one large claw, and they used that claw to entice females and to fight with other males. So they're kind of competing for who is the strongest and the most fit to breed with the females. And I compared it to the Skittle commercial where they resolve things in this town by arm wrestling. So this kind of shows that similar situation here. So if you recall, we talked about Tim Bergen's main questions, the approximate versus ultimate causation. Approximate meaning how do behaviors change, and ultimate, why do behaviors change. Your book uses the sticklebacks and how they are aggressive when they see the color red. The proximate cause would be the what changes, so that the red belly indicates an intruding male, and so the other male will attack it. And the why does the other male attack it, the ultimate cause, and that is because, again, he is trying to protect his territories, especially when females lay eggs and fertilization is external. And your book goes into the differences between internal and external fertilization. So the male wants to make sure that the eggs he's protecting are his and not fertilized by another male. And we talked about migratory birds and how we have now determined that there are kind of like small magnets in the brain or sinus cavity of these organisms, and that they can use the Earth's magnetic field lines to navigate their migratory patterns. We also talked about behavioral rhythms, and we referred to circadian rhythms, and that we all are familiar with our sleep-wake cycles, which many of you, your sleep-wake cycles may have already shifted so that you're staying up quite late and waking up quite late in the day, which hopefully you will all start to get that recalibrated before we come back to school. And then we have this thing called biological rhythms, and they're generally linked to reproductive cycles and migratory patterns. And if you think about it, it would not be good for cows or horses to be calving currently, because they would not have, at least in the wild, they would not have the food resources to supply or nurse that young calf or foal. So again, it is a survivorship trait that if a female was to calf or foal this time of year, that it could lead to the death of the offspring and possibly mother, then that trait would not be passed on to other cows or horses. The horses or cows that go into season during an appropriate time of the year then will be successful, and that trait would then be carried on with their offspring. Now, behavior rhythms linked to a yearly cycle are called circannual rhythm. And this is, like I said, generally dictated by day length and not food availability with response to season. So this has to do with, as we know, the day length right now is very short, and then eventually it'll get longer. And so those behaviors will change with the, like I said, the daylight, which again, once the days start getting longer, we're going to see that with animals either going into season or coming out of hibernation. So when we talk about animal communication, that's a stimulus related to another individual is called a signal. There are 4 different types of signals. We have visual, chemical, tactile, and auditory. So we talk about chemical signals. These are generally called pheromones. That's a hormone that is secreted, usually in many of the organisms in their urine. So they have these glands which will secrete scents that mark their territory. And most of you are familiar with male dogs doing that. Female dogs also will mark their territory. Cats will mark. Most of us get our male cats fixed before that happens, because if you've ever smelled it, it is really stinky. So again, this is a way of communicating to other animals in their species, or even other species, to stay away. This is my area. We also have auditory, which of course is making sounds, and we're very familiar with talking and communicating. Other animals will also communicate with each other. If you have a dog that barks, you're very familiar with that. Visual, that would be mating rituals, posturing, some kind of body language that will send a signal to another individual in that population. And then we have tactile, which is most commonly seen as, touching, so grooming or even dancing. We talked about the bee waggle. So here's a review of the bee waggle, or called the honey bee dance. And when the bee returns from exploring for looking for food, if food is nearby, they will dance or walk in circles, called the round dance. If it's a longer distance, they will wag their tail, so they'll walk and they'll turn in a certain direction, and the length of their straight path will dictate how far away the food is, and then the angle at which they walk will give direction. So here's some examples of how they can show you distance and direction with that honeybee dance. So let's talk about Tinbergen's how, and those are innate behaviors or actions that appear natural to most animals. We're going to talk about fixed action pattern, mating dances, and marking territories. So we've talked about that fixed action pattern, which was like the stickleback with that red color. The mating dances kind of speaks for itself in marking territories. But some other types of behaviors are learned, and that's that nature versus nurture. So nature versus nurture. Learning. What is the definition of learning? So we talk about learning as a durable change in behavior brought on by some experience. Now, imprinting is a form of learning, and that's kind of like that whole idea of do as I say, not as I do, although we know that actions speak so much louder than words. And we can see that, and when we observe, especially children with parents, it is a much higher likelihood that children will smoke if they are brought up by parents who also smoke cigarettes. We also know that there's something called the sensitivity period, where the offspring recognizes its parents. So we hear a lot about how birds often imprint with other organisms. And in this picture, you can see that this dog has imprinted on these ducks. Some of you guys may have remembered that from the Twilight trilogy, when they talked about how I can't even remember. Was it Jacob imprinted on Bella's daughter? So if you're a big Twilight person, you'll remember that. We talk about a cognitive map. It's an internal representation of a spatial relationship among objects in an animal's surrounding. Human females tend to be more like this with spatial learning. And that when we go places, we tend to look at markers, not so much as street names, but this house or that tree or that market or whatever, where males tend to know names of streets. I mean, this is definitely one gender thing that we can see is different between male and females. Not all males and females, but it's a general rule of thumb. And we can see that here with this female wasp. So she recognizes that her nest is amongst these markers here, and scientists move these markers, and of course the wasp went right for where the nest would have been, inside the pine cones. She eventually did find the nest, but then she had to reset her mind and make a new map in her mind to find it when she left again. But they are able to learn this, so this is a learned behavior. When we talk about associated learning, this is the ability to really relate a similar experience to a current one. There's two main types of associated learning. One is the classical conditioning, which we were talking about when the bell so conveniently rang during my lecture. But we know, like with Pavlov's dogs. So even though in reality a bell does not truly represent I'm going to be fed, if a dog has been trained that I'm going to ring the bell before every time I feed you, their body starts to respond to that bell as a sign that dinner's coming. So this is where we see the dog salivating with the bell even though there's no food there. Operant conditioning, there's two different types of operant conditioning. Again, this is the dog or the animal does some kind of behavior. They're either negatively punished for that behavior, the bad behavior, so they won't repeat that bad behavior. And most of us know that with potty training, when we potty train our puppies. And then we can also have a positive reward system, and that when they do a desired behavior, we reward that. So this is, like I said, really seen in dog training, where you have different schools where you only do positive or negative, where really it's kind of a combination of the two. And you see that in parenting also. Cognitive problem solving, that's awareness, reasoning, recollection, and judgment. It was believed that only primates and marine mammals, so we're talking about like dolphins, had this ability, okay, so that they were aware of themselves, they were able to reason through situations. But now we're finding that may not be true. We have the bee example in your book, and we also know that there are variations of levels of learning within a species. So although some organisms may be able to reason, it's not at the level that Homo sapiens do. So development of learned behaviors, your book goes in quite a bit of detail talking about how the young birds will learn their song. They start off by singing just small portions of it until eventually they've mastered that. We also know that primates have learned how to correctly communicate information as well. There are certain screams that are letting them, other people in their, I shouldn't say people, but other primates in their population know that there is a predator coming from either above or below, and there's a particular warning call for each of those types of situations, and the young will learn how to give the appropriate signal. So natural selection and behavior. So how does genetics play into behavior? Now the book discusses two alleles of a gene which dictates the distance a fruit fly larvae travel. So again, if food is scarce, you're going to need to go further out to find that food. But there's a balance to that, because if you're spending more energy looking for food than you're obtaining, it is not energetically favorable. Whereas if there were plenty of food near, you wouldn't want to have to go and exert yourself to go get food that's further away. So basically, those individuals that have those traits that make them successful minimize their energy expenditures. That makes them more able to spend that energy in reproducing. And of course, then if they're reproducing more of their kind or passing their genes on to more of their offspring, that group of individuals will become more represented in the population, and therefore those genes will be more successful. So here's where we can look at energy cost. We talk about the birds. They were talking about birds flying a certain height and then dropping the snails, and then they would break when they dropped them on the rocks. Again, if they flew too high, yes, the snail would still break, but that would be extra energy that they spent. If they didn't fly high enough, they'd have to make a second trip, again, spending more energy. So the birds in this case that could learn from experience how high they needed to fly to minimize energy expenditures and to maximize the benefits from the food would be more successful. And this just kind of shows you the same idea here. We have a fish, a different type of prey here. We have a bird, a predatory bird, looking for a fish. So it's all about maximizing their benefits with their cost. And I don't want you guys to think of this as, okay, the bird is calculating, if I fly so high, it costs me such and such in calories. It's just a matter of trial and error. And the birds that were able to figure this out would be more successful. And then they would pass those abilities. Maybe it was a higher ability to think, to reason, to judge than other offspring. So you could say the smartest birds pass those smart genes on to their offspring, and they're successful at it. So adaptive mating behavior, females choose males based on survival of offspring. So again, females are looking for males that are the healthiest, the strongest, maybe the smartest, but whatever it is, they're looking for males that are going to have the most successful set of traits. Not because that male may or may not help them rear their offspring, but those successful traits will hopefully then be represented in their offspring. So their offspring will also be successful. Now we see this in a term that's called dimorphism. And dimorphism is where the males and females of a species look really different. They have different sizes and appearances. Females generally are neutral in color to blend in, where males are brightly colored to attract females. Males are bigger to show strength and reproductive success. And again, females will pick a male which they feel will make their offspring also successful. So here we can see some pictures. We can see the male up here, the female. Again, the female wants to blend in, so when she's sitting on her eggs, she will not be easily seen. Here we've got the elephant seal. This is not a young and an old. This is the male right here, and then the female. And then down here, you guys are all familiar with the peacock. So you see the beautiful male peacock versus the female really isn't all that spectacular. So mating behaviors, we have different tendencies to either be monogamous or polygamous. And we can see with different species, it is different based on the needs in rearing their offspring. So this is referred to as social behavior. So we have mating systems. Again, the costs and benefits of each potential mating system varies from species to species. We have monogamy where just one male and one female. In humans, that works the best since a human offspring requires a lot of parental care. Polygamy, there's two types of polygamy. There's polyandry and then polygyny. And so when we have the polyandry, that's where we have one female with multiple males. Not really seen very often. What we normally see is multiple females with one male. And then, of course, we have promiscuity, where you have multiple males and females. So again, we're back to that cost and benefits. Is it cost effective to help raise the offspring? Does it increase the probability that the offspring will be more successful? Is the male sure the offspring are his? These are all questions that will determine whether the male will stay and help to raise the offspring. If there's no benefit for the offspring for him to stay, he will go and find another female to mate with, again to increase the number of offspring he could produce. But if he leaves and his offspring die, then this does not benefit him, and if anything, it was a waste of energy to reproduce with that female if his offspring does not survive. Now again, I don't want you to think of this as a male or a female thinking, oh, I'm going to be successful by having lots of kids. It's a matter of that male that stays and helps raise his offspring will survive and pass those genes on to the next generation. If the male does not stay, they die, and those set of genes will die with them. So again, it's not a real sign. I don't want to say it's altruism. We're going to talk about altruism, but if the male doesn't stay and the offspring dies, he will end up dying eventually, and so will his offspring, and those set of characteristics will die with them. If it was a male that stayed and raised those offspring, and the offspring were successful, they will still be here, and they will be passing those altruistic or helping genes to their children, and they will also stay and help and raise their offspring. And those are the group of individuals that will stay and are here today. The other ones that may not have helped are dead, so it's a moot point. Okay, whether those traits that they may have carried might be helpful or useful later, it doesn't matter. They're not a living anymore. So I don't want you thinking about that male actually doing the calculations in his head. It's just a matter of who is still around to pass on the good genes. Now we talk about male competition. This leads to less variation among males. So you will see that males in these dimorphic groups look very similar. However, there are very large variations between the male and female, and we can see this here. Here's another example of dimorphism. Again, the female is right here, very small, and I don't want to say boring looking, but not nearly as ornamental as the male. Now, the idea of kin selection was pondered at first by Darwin. So, of course, Darwin's thinking about all these things in an evolutionary sense. So he said a tribe including many members who were always ready to give aid to each other and sacrifice themselves for a common good would be victorious over the other tribes. This would be natural selection. So again, those individuals that work well as a group, a community, would be able to endure any possible threats to their group or maybe any environmental changes because they would work together as a team. Hopefully those good genes then would be propagated by their success for being a group. So Darwin thought that altruism was caused by group selection. Maybe those individuals that were loners or self-sufficient or went off on their own, they may have been picked up by predators or not have the skill set needed by themselves to survive, versus a group that maybe had some variation in the different skill sets that together as a group, they were quite successful. So when we talk about altruism, there's different terminologies here you need to know. There's kin selection, and that's a behavior which increases an individual's chances of his or her genes being propagated into the next generation. Altruism is a behavior characterized by self-denial or self-sacrifice to benefit others, seen especially among close kin. And that's where we got that inclusive fitness, an individual's own fitness and his or her effect on the fitness of any biological kin. And we can see an example of this, and this is grooming. So behavior among Japanese macaques is one example of altruistic behavior, though it extends to non-kin as well. And again, if they can get rid of the parasites that are on each other, that means that they're saving energy by not feeding these parasites. And so this is a behavior that is beneficial to the group here. So Hamilton tried to put this in some type of quantitative formula. So what he came up with is when is altruism beneficial? When is the cost too high for the individual to help out another person or another organism in that population? And so he came up with this formula. And so R is the relatedness. This is the proportion of the shared genes. So an example would be a sibling would have a higher number of shared genes than a cousin or a second cousin or some distant relative. Okay, so then B is the benefit to the recipient. So how many more offspring can that recipient produce by helping that individual that's related to them? And then C is the cost to the altruist. So is the benefit over here, is it greater than the cost? And that's where it boils down to, should I help that individual? And if I help that individual, how does it help me? Or does it cost me too much? And so this is where we're going to weigh this out. And again, individuals don't sit there and do the math in their head. It's just if it comes out mathematically in their favor, then they are successful. If it's too high of a cost, eventually it will be less successful for that individual, and they will not pass on their genes to as many offspring. So I hope you have read the chapter. The guided reading is on Canvas with the answers. Make sure that as you go through this chapter, if there are any questions that you have, you can either email me or write them down, and we'll discuss them when we get back on Monday.